This episode is sponsored by Fold AR. Have you ever wanted to carry a little more firepower than just a pistol? In the current trying times, it'd be nice to have an AR that fits in a backpack the size of a briefcase. Fold AR has solved that problem for you. They come in a few different versions: fold and half rifles, fold and thirds, and even an AR pistol. Don't worry about finding the perfect backpack to fit them in. They come in a backpack specifically for them, and they look just like a regular small pack. Fold ARs don't just fold up and conceal easily, but they are very safe and will hold their own at the range. Fold AR is the perfect combination of concealment and firepower. Today's sponsor is Forever Barnwood. Guys, we have been using this in our renovation of our building here in Powell, Wyoming, and I am here to tell you it is amazing. They are a premier supplier of barnwood across the U.S. Their products come from fresh-cut Wisconsin white pine, which has been kiln-dried way below standard lumber and hand-processed into various products like barn doors, beams, flooring, and wall covering. This type of lumber product provides all of the advantage of reclaimed barnwood at a fraction of the cost, not to mention how easy it is to work with because it's straight lumber and it doesn't have all the waste. Their barnwood products are a renewable resource and come in a variety of widths and lengths, large sizes for countertops, beams, posts, stairs, and railing systems, as well as wall covering and everything else. Their prices are only a fraction of the cost elsewhere, and they can ship anywhere you need it. With their innovative barnwood products, you'll have the right piece at the right time for your special project. So check them out at foreverbarnwood.com, and no matter what your project is, Forever Barnwood has you covered. Well, Brandon, thank you for sitting down with me and going over a topic that we get asked a lot of questions about. Obviously, living in Wyoming, having some of the biggest winter ranges out west here in Wyoming for deer, elk too, but mostly we're going to talk about deer today. You've kind of taken it upon yourself the last few years to go down to the winter range and take some photos and videos, actually even before the bad winter. So we have kind of a comparison of before the bad winter, and then, you know, we got a couple winters here since that. I just got back last night. I went down there again because we're kind of at this like pivotal moment in winter range habitat populations, good winters versus bad winters, of kind of the make it or break it. I mean, I don't want to be a fearmonger, but this one is really critical because we're about halfway, or we're about 25% of the way back to where the capacity on that winter range, which we're going to talk a lot about, the Red Desert winter range, which is the one that, you know, a lot of guys ask us about. But we're also going to talk about some of the other ones that people don't recognize or aren't as, you know, don't have the notoriety that the Red Desert does. But thanks for coming on. So what did, you know, why did you take this upon yourself to just go down there and film and take photos?
Well, it's fairly self-serving, obviously. One of the things that, you know, I grew up in western North Dakota, and I was very fortunate to hunt some phenomenal mule deer country, and that's what my family did. We were mule deer people. And then when I was a teenager and I was just consuming every hunting video at that time on VHS tapes and every hunting magazine and everything that I could consume, it was really hard at that time to find mule deer content. It was mostly whitetail, which understandably so. They're spread across a diversity of landscapes, huge populations in the country hunt them, so there's a lot of demand for that. And we whitetail hunted too, but we were mostly mule deer guys. And then I stumbled on these videos from this family called Eastmans when I was young, and
a couple years ago then.
Yeah, a couple years ago, and dating myself.
VHS.
Yeah, in grocery store rental departments and stuff that don't even exist anymore. But and I've been a mule deer fanatic my whole life. I love mule deer. It's my favorite thing to do, and the old Eastmans winter range videos and everything. They just feel that fire so much so that's what I chose to do for a career. I went into wildlife and fisheries management for a degree. Worked in that field for a while with agencies and nonprofit groups, and which we can get into. But and so really, what got me here in my career are those old winter range videos that I watched, and they just fueled that fire, and I would watch them over and over and over and over again. So much so that even my son, who's now 19, when he was tiny, his first word seriously was deer, because we had those videos playing so much. He'd throw a fit if we take those winter range videos out and put in like a little kid's video. He would throw a temper tantrum. That's how much we watch that content. Wow. And so, working here at Eastmans for quite a while now, and just having some time in my career, and kids are getting older and all that, I'm like, I'm going down the winter range, man. That's like, to me, that's like hallowed ground. And of course I've been, hunting in places like Region G and stuff, and, over the past decade, but I've never made the time to go down during the winter time. Plus we're at trade shows during that time of year. It's hard to get away. But I had a window there where I'm like, I'm going to go down, whether we were going to do it for work or not. And I want to see these deer doing what they're doing down on the winter range, even though it's a fraction of what it used to be back in the heyday that your family videoed. So
yeah, so those that don't know, this actually started a long time ago, when my dad, who's 70, I think he's 77 now, when he was in 8th grade, his father, Grandpa Gordon, they jumped in, they moved to Jackson from Washington State, and they jumped in the rig and they went down to Pinedale, Wyoming, because they kept hearing about all these deer, these big deer down there. And they, our family didn't start deer hunting in the 60s. This has been generational. In fact, one of the biggest deer my grandfather killed was actually in Washington. This is what they did. They, eat and breathe and sleep mule deer.
And Washington historically has been big mule deer country.
Yeah, north and east of Seattle, they got huge mule deer. Lots of good habitat, really good genetics. I mean, they have some of the biggest. And now, of course, they've mismanaged it because Washington does that. But they used to have really, really big mule deer. So they jump in the old Suburban, the 1962 Suburban or whatever it was, and went to Pinedale. And there's a funny story my dad tells about, he's in 8th grade. He's just bouncing along at 22 below zero on a really crappy road, and they get to Pinedale and have to fuel up. And my grandfather jumps out of the Suburban and asks the fuel attendant, the gas station attendant, which they had those back then.
Full service.
Yeah, full service. And fill her up. Hey, by the way, where are all these deer everybody's talking about? And the guy looks at him like, are you kidding me? And he just does this, like, look around. He just turns around, looks around. My dad, he says, all I remember is rolling down the window, and the hills, the sagebrush hills, were just crawling, looked like ants, just deer everywhere. Well, that's 62. That's what they call the heyday of mule deer. It was after World War II. They had completely annihilated all the predators, because they were also growing sheep and cattle on this area to feed the war machine. They needed a lot of sheep, a lot of wool blankets, and a lot of wool pants and all that stuff for the war machine. And so they killed all the predators, birds of prey, coyotes, wolves. They poisoned everything out there. Well, that helped the mule deer population significantly. Plus, there were some good winters that happened in the 50s, because there was a really bad winter in 49, some really good winters in the 50s, and this population exploded. And I've heard estimates. I don't know if they're accurate. We'll get into Gary Freilich, who's the biologist down there now. His carrying capacity for that winter range is 40,000 deer. I heard back in the heyday there was 250,000 deer on that winter range, which would be maggots, right? Yeah. They would just crawling everywhere. But yeah, and so that happened, and then my grandfather started filming the deer, and it really came to fruition in the 80s when my grandfather built a film called Rocky Mountain Mule Deer Hunting. Or it was just called Rocky Mountain Mule Deer, actually. He wasn't a huge fan of hunting films. He did them. He had a few hunting, Northwest Territories and stuff, but it wasn't focused around hunting. It was focused around the animals. But in the 80s, they started filming these deer. and they found the legendary one. That was Morty, and
the first,
and they found him. I remember the buzz as a kid. I mean, I was probably, I don't know, 6, maybe 7, and the buzz when they found him the second year in a row, and he looked even bigger than he was the year before, and he wintered in the same place, and they found him again. And there's some footage of my dad and my Uncle Rod, they're all bundled up in whites with the camera, and they're taking film of him. Because, you didn't have a Zoom, so you had to walk out there, snowshoe out there, and film that deer. And then in the 90s, my dad filmed Popeye, which is probably the most noticeable one. And then, of course, Goliath, and there's a couple others. There's Corkscrew and a couple other deer. And it's actually happened a couple times since then. There's Lumberhead was in Utah, and then there's the King Buck, which is up there. There was a buck a couple years ago that was just giant. I don't know if they ever named him the Big Drop Time.
Yeah, I don't know. Because he was alive about the same time as the King Buck, and I'm sure somebody had a nickname for him, but he wasn't, I guess, notably called anything that I know of anyway.
Right. Well, somebody named them. They didn't promote it much.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the winter range has been really interesting in the history of it, and I appreciate your appreciation for it and being able to do it. So, what did you notice before this big bad winter of 22 to the winter of 22 to what you saw this year?
Well, the first year that I went down, first it was just cool to be down there during that time of year. Again, I've been in the area a bunch, but never on the legendary winter range while the deer were there. And so I saw, I didn't see anything that was the caliber of Popeye and Morty, even though that was when the King Buck was there, and he was there the year after that too. I never turned him up, but there were some other deer that were phenomenal that we filmed and took some photos of, and I wasn't unimpressed. I wasn't impressed with the amount of deer. There was deer around. They were in certain key pockets that historically, which we've learned from the migration film that we did with the biologists that have, GPS collared all these deer, and they know the consistency with which these animals, for the most part, unless there's a major weather event, return to the same spots basically every year. And so I was just kind of getting to know where they were hanging out and seeing some pretty good bucks, seeing, a fair amount of does. It was cool. It was cool to see. Then the next year, was the onset of that bad winter. The worst one since '49. All the older guys are saying, I haven't seen winters like this since I was a kid. And it was epic. I've got footage and photography where it looks like you're in Siberia, or what we imagine Siberia to look like.
You can't even see the sagebrush.
No, it's completely, you've got sagebrush that's, this tall, that's
3 feet
completely covered. Completely covered. And that was in January, and it got much worse after January. Several more feet of snow out there. And so that's where we heard the numbers that conservatively there was an 80% die-off of that herd, which is, if you have multiple winters like that and maybe drought conditions following it or whatever, you're talking about maybe never again in our lifetimes will we see an impressive deer herd down there if the conditions are perfectly horrible, if that makes sense.
So 80%, just to put it in perspective for those that can't do math like me, it's 40,000 deer is the carrying capacity of that range. 80% of that means 32,000 of those deer died, and that means there's only 8,000 left. Now, I've heard since then, of course, they got better numbers. I've heard it was less than 4,000 deer, less than 10%.
Yeah,
and more importantly, it killed all the fawns.
Yeah,
they had one fawn. They collared 100 fawns that fall. And then, obviously, they track them all winter, and only one of those fawns survived that winter.
Yeah, which is, almost 100% mortality.
Yeah.
Which is hard to really get your brain around. And I'm originally from, like I said, North Dakota, where winters are really hard, and you're used to big population die-offs every decade or two or something. Then they come roaring back. But to hear that much, 100% fawn mortality, that
means an entire generation of deer wiped out.
Gone. And, there's a lot of ways to look at it too. It could be, the good Lord's way of cleaning house. cleaning up the population, whether it's CWD wise or genetically or whatever. We don't know. I mean, that's
one of the things when we did the migration film. If you haven't seen it, go look at it on YouTube. It's called Imperiled. We did that the year before the bad winter. And of course we got to sit down with Gary Freilich and some of these bios like Matt and, these guys that are studying the winter range, studying mule deer habitats, getting information that they've never got before because they collared all generations of deer, does, fawns, bucks, different generations. They know so much about that and how that all works for the first time in history. But the population was at its carrying capacity back then. It was at 40,000. In fact, Gary, I think at one point, I don't know if he said this on camera or if we put it in there, but at one point he said we might be a little over carrying capacity. And he was really worried about the habitat. The mountain mahogany was a real problem, and the sagebrush was dying of old age. And is there going to be a regrowth? Is there going to be what can we do as humans? Obviously, we're doing certain things like overpasses. There's wildlife overpass. You go driving down the highway between Pinedale and Bondurant, and there's two of these huge overpasses where the deer can go across from one highway or from one side of the highway to the other side of the highway, that's a huge barrier. Highways are a huge barrier. In fact, he told us a number, and I can't remember what it is, but the death mortality of deer getting on the highway is like 4 or 5 times what we do as a hunter. I mean, it's insane. That's really where a lot of our deer are dying, besides winter. But the habitat was in kind of a trouble. They were worried about it and having to do, places like Muley Fanatics here in Wyoming or the Wyoming Sportsman's or Mule Deer Foundation. These guys were planting sagebrush and, new sagebrush, trying to rejuvenate that habitat. Maybe to your point, maybe killing these deer off and giving that habitat 2 or 3 years to come back. That might be the cycle. That might just be how it happened. And it may have happened in history before and we just didn't know it.
Well, and that's one of the things that I try to guard my own feeble little brain, I guess, about making too many outlandish claims, because a lot of times we're just looking at, say, deer management in this case, through the lens of our lifetime, or maybe even our dad's and grandfather's lifetimes.
Maybe 3 generations, but probably not.
Yeah, and it sounds like a long time to us, but when you're talking about landscape scale, land management, population management, I really firmly believe, and this is just my opinion, that we don't know what we don't know. I just think that I think it's good that all the biologists in the state agencies and some of the federal agencies, they're learning, they're studying, they're getting more data points on the graph, so to speak, which is good. It's a good thing, because then in another 100 years, that information will be here, where we don't have that solid of information going back 200 years, 300 years, 400 years. It's anecdotal stories, which are important too. But as far as official agency observations and collections and surveys and all that, it's still really, in the big scheme of human history, is in its infancy.
Yeah.
And we like to think that we know more than we do. And sometimes I think maybe even some of the things that we do think we know, they might be accurate. We just don't know 100% yet if they are.
Right.
And so I'm glad that, continue to collect all this information like they are doing. That's a good thing. And then maybe before making, whether it's us as guys that aren't in an agency or wildlife managers, kind of condition the statement. It's like we think this is what's happening on the landscape, but we say it's so definitive, like there's no question on every topic, and I think that's just dangerous. But I'm glad that guys like Gary are around. I mean, he's been fighting the mule deer battle for a long time, and I like him too, because he's kind of an unbiased type of guy, where he just wants the data to speak, and he loves those mule deer out there, like we do, and just wants to see them doing well. So anyway, yeah. So that bad winter, the major die-off, and then last winter. So this is February of 2025 right now as we record this. last winter, 2024, at the same time, or in January, I didn't go back out, partially because we knew the die-off numbers. And even though because of how they have the winter range shut down, so you can't just be chasing these deer all over the place, which is a good thing. It's still, you try not to disturb them much, and you stick to the main roads, and you're not trouncing through the snow after them or nothing. Last year, because it was so bad, I didn't even want to go down there then. Even just a little bit, you might be disturbing them when you're on the highway or a county road. It's just, I didn't want to push that envelope. And I think a lot of people that like to look at the deer were in the same situation. And so now this year we'd heard, we've had favorable weather conditions, and we're hearing good reports of what people are seeing. And in fact, we didn't even go into the famous Region G or H at all to look for deer during hunting season, because we're like, let's just let it be for a while. And so this winter, I went back down there. Man, was it encouraging what I was seeing. And the anecdotal stuff, I wasn't out there with a counter or nothing. And, we're videoing and taking photos. And I took one of my kids with me that she's interested in the photography stuff, and was teaching her some things. And I had a great time doing it. But the incidental stuff that I was seeing, or the anecdotal stuff, I was like, man, it seems like I'm seeing a lot of fawns to
triplets.
does,
and lots of triplets, and
a lot of up and comer bucks, like we kind of expected. I mean, the volume of really good looking young 4-point mule deer in that 150 to 170 class was amazing. They were everywhere, and so that makes you feel good. Like, man, this next fall, the fall after that, if conditions stay favorable, could be really good. Then Wyoming Game and Fish numbers come out from Gary Freilich and others that backed up the anecdotal stuff that I saw. And, you're talking about, 83 fawns to 100 does, which is up exponentially by a factor of
usually fawn
10.
Usually fawn recruitment's like 25%, 25 to 35. They say 25 is where you've got a healthy population. It's not growth, but it's maintenance. If you get into that 60 to 75%, it's exponential growth. You're in 83. That's huge. That's a huge number, which is awesome.
Yep. And the buck to doe ratios are almost to where the management objective is. So the ratios are good. The numbers are growing. And so if we can get through the rest of this winter without any catastrophic events that are sustained. I mean, a storm is one thing, but a storm that never, in the snow never melts and the temperatures stay at 20 below zero, and that's where it becomes problematic. Because by the time we get to, say it's February now, you get another month or two into this, and it's still harsh winter. That's when we have problems.
Yeah. So one of the reasons why I went down there this weekend, because we were about 5 weeks apart between when I went down and when you went down. Partially because it's right before Hunt Expo. And one of the number one question I get asked from those guys in Utah and from all over the country at that show, Mule Deer Foundation puts on an epic show. If you haven't been to Salt Lake, go to the Hunt Expo. It is, if you're a Western hunting guy, it's the place to be. It's where all the new gear comes out. There's tons of like-minded guys that are, all about conservation, all about hunting, and lots of fun hunting stories, deer hunting stories. But I get that question 100 times a day. How's the winter range? How's the winter range? And so this year I decided, I'm going to go down there and I'm just going to look. We're Hunt Expos this week. And so I'm going to go look and see what it's like, if it's changed at all since you were down there. Cause you bring back photos and go, there's no winter. I mean, there's snow, but
not much,
nothing. Those deer are living in high cotton.
Yeah.
I went down there, and this weekend there's still nothing. Now there's places, the mountains are getting it. I was able to get up into the high country on a snowmobile this weekend just to see what it's like up there, and they got plenty of snow, so it's not going to be a moisture problem. But the winter range didn't get hammered. I mean, you drop off of part of it outside of Farson, there's zero snow, which is really good. But you're right. From now until April is really critical, because this is when we get dumped on, and then it warms up and it crusts that snow. And then if we get a cold snap, that's what's really hard. My dad used to say this all the time. It's not the amount of snow. Deer can deal if it's fluffy. And deer can deal if it's 20 below zero.
Mm-hmm.
They can eat enough groceries to keep them alive, to keep the fire burning. But it's when you get a lot of snow and it's below zero, and then you add a crust level where they're having to dig through that crust level to get to that sagebrush, to get to the forbs. That's when things go sideways really, really fast.
Yeah,
and when the water sources fall up.
Yeah, and we saw that year of the bad winter a couple years ago. It was already really bad in January, and every deer I saw was having to dig their way down to the food, and their faces would be covered in snow from eating, and buck's antlers would be covered in snow, and it was brutally cold too when we were down there. I mean, it's always, it gets pretty cold down in that part of the state anyway, but it was consistently really cold. Like this year I was down there, one of the days it was 16 below zero, one of the days.
Right.
That's just what every day was like that year. Yeah, it was terrible.
And it dips into the 30s and 40s. That's where things are really, really bad.
Oh.
I was there middle of the day, and it was 34 degrees, in Pinedale, the middle of the day. So that's really, 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 it looks really good. And they're estimating about 11,000 deer. So in 2 years, they went from less than 4,000 to 11,000. Well, that's just numbers. You start having triplets for 3 years in a row, you can exponentially grow that population. They're young. I didn't see any deer that were really old. Mm-hmm. I mean, I saw a really nice 190 plus deer buck, but he's 2, 3 maybe.
Young looking. And as your dad and your uncle saw with Morty back in the day, one of his claims to fame is the first year they saw him, he was a beautiful, non-typical buck. But the next year, a whole nother caliber. I think he put on like 40 inches of antler or some crazy thing.
When he went from 4 to 5.
Yeah, it was nuts. And these deer, a lot of them are 2.5, and they're already looking pretty good. And so if, they say that a buck mule deer won't reach its full antler potential, generally speaking, until they're about 7.5. Most deer don't even get to 7.5. Right. So if they can at least get to 4.5, then you're seeing some impressive things antler development wise.
Yeah, that's one thing that we learned during this process is that these deer, you see a 4-point buck, that deer might be 1, might be a year and a half or 2 years old, and he's already a 4-point, and 7, they're a 200 plus inch deer. Just that's how fast they mature there, and they don't get old. One of the things, because Gary collects all the data, he sits on that road. There's just 2 main roads into this place, and he sits on that road and collects all the deer. Every deer that comes out of there dead, he collects the data off it. And he's only had 1 or 2 bucks that are 10 years old. Most of them are under 7. Yeah. And I think he's only had a handful of bucks that weren't 4 points. If you think about that, hundreds of deer over the course of 30 years, and only a few of them are less than 4 points, and most of them are, a kid shot the first deer he saw kind of thing. Mm-hmm. That's crazy. That's a genetic,
it's a gold mine.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's really, really encouraging. Hopefully we can maintain this winter down there, and hopefully this is, we're on our comeback. In fact, you and I talked recently. Maybe not this year, but next year, if it continues, I'm probably going to hunt down there again. We're kind of back into that, in that sweet spot.
Well, and like you mentioned at the beginning of this, so that's the one that everyone wants to talk about, partially because of that old classic footage and the nostalgia around those big bucks.
Yeah, you can see the progression.
Yeah, but that's obviously not the only winter range in the country. And you got to see a little bit of part of Idaho this weekend, and coming back up through Jackson, down through DuBois. And so one of the things that the collaring of these deer really set the data apart. Now, my dad and my family's known that the deer on the west side of the same mountain range, they don't cross the mountain range. Popeye did, but he was that's one of the things that made him really unique, is that he crossed 2 mountain ranges, 2 major rivers to winter. And that's, for whatever reason, that's what his mom taught him. And so that's what he did. Mm-hmm. But the majority of the deer that winter or summer where Popeye summered, those deer fall off the west side of that slope and they go out into Idaho and they winter in Idaho. And for a number of years, Idaho and Wyoming weren't playing under the same rules. They'd go out, they'd start migrating and they'd get into Idaho in November, and those guys would shoot them during the rut.
and they didn't realize that they were shooting all Wyoming's deer. Well, they've since changed that. And so I got to go out to that winter range this weekend, and it is just as good as ours. I mean, it's just unbelievable. It's snowing where they summer. I mean, snowing. There's 60 inches on the level up in the mountains. But out in the winter range, those deer were doing really good. And so,
well, and before you go on to the next point too, just to bring something up that a lot of people don't think about because you just haven't had the opportunity to be in these conversations or haven't done this for a living, is that those deer making their way across the state line into multiple different counties. Mm-hmm. You never know where animals are going to end up in the wintertime. And so sometimes you'll see deer herded up or yarded up around, say, a rancher's haystacks. And understandably so, that rancher is very frustrated because he works hard for that, right? That's one of his resources, one of his assets to keep his operation.
Just eating it, they're ruining it by
they crap all over it, and everything. And so you understand the frustration. And naturally, in his mind, we got too many deer. We need to kill some of these deer. And he wants permission, and sometimes states grant this, kill permits, for a depredation problem. The problem with that is you don't know where all those deer came from. And so you could be annihilating an entire region's population from another state.
Right. Just
because that's where they chose to winter. And especially if it's a really bad winter, like we had a couple of years ago, they'll show up in places you weren't used to seeing them because they're just looking for food. And so there is no easy answer to that. Trust me, I've been on the receiving end of that as a game and fish guy, getting chewed out by both sportsmen and ranchers because of that same problem, and they're on different sides of the coin. And so it's a difficult situation, but it's important for everybody to understand that just killing animals that are a problem in the wintertime around certain feed sources, it's not as simple as it sounds. Right. I mean, even in states like some of the plain states, that largely have non-migratory herds. If the winters are bad enough, they'll travel 2 states to find a food source. Like that's been documented with radio collared information.
I'll go a long ways to find a burger.
Yeah, exactly. So, to what you're saying, those Wyoming deer, some of them are going into Idaho. They don't know state lines.
Or Utah.
They don't know game and fish regulations.
And so
that's part of the
a long ways for a burger.
Yeah. I mean, we're all at times really critical of the agencies, which sometimes it needs to be. But man, they got a tough job. They got to manage what the ranchers can tolerate, and they got to manage objectives, like we keep talking about carrying capacity of the landscape for wildlife, and they got to manage sportsmen's expectations, right. and plus deal with politicians in the mix. So it's a tough gig, man. And just wanted to bring that up because of what you're saying, that these Wyoming deer ended up across these state lines.
Well, yeah, during the bad winter, Utah put they threw caution to the wind, right, wrong, or indifferent, doesn't matter. This is what they did. They decided they were going to feed the deer. Come to find out, they were feeding a bunch of Wyoming deer. Mm-hmm. A bunch of collared deer, went 150 miles southwest and got fed in Utah and survived.
Yep.
Which is we can argue about that on another podcast about feed or no feed, mm-hmm. which is it's quite the argument. And there's studies that show both directions, from guys that ran feedlots and from guys that ran game and fish departments that fed deer, and from guys that run game and fish departments that don't feed the deer. That's a very complex conversation. We'll do that at a different point. We're talking winter range. The other thing that I got to do is when I went to Idaho, I said, geez, there's another winter range in Wyoming that's just as critical, but doesn't have quite the notoriety because of, obviously our family's been filming those deer since the 60s, so it's almost 70 years of promotion to that winter range. Let's go to some of the other ones. Let's go to Idaho and look mm-hmm. at that. And then we went to one by DuBois, which those that aren't familiar with DuBois, Jackson Hole, east of Jackson Hole on the north side of Jackson, south side of the park, is a little town called DuBois. By the way, it has one of the best military vehicle museums on the planet. It is so cool. If you're planning a trip out here, make sure you spend 2 days there, because I tried to do it in an hour. No, it's a 2-day trip. It's unreal. But they have a winter range not too far from where that museum is. Actually, that museum sits right along the highway. Across the river and up on a plateau is the winter range, the mule deer winter range. And they have a huge sheep winter range there called the Whiskey Mountain Sheep Winter Range. They've done lots of films on those deer, or those sheep, but the deer in the winter range there looks just as good. It's unbelievable. There's new growth sagebrush, which was a really concern about the habitat. There's new growth sagebrush. The old sagebrush is dying out, which it's a cycle. It has to happen. Maybe it died out because of, the bad winter. Maybe it winter froze, or, winter die off with the sagebrush too. Who knows? But the winter range is coming back. There's a couple other big time winter ranges, and somebody needs to do a story on this one. Back when my dad was outfitting north of Jackson, he tells this funny story that one of the first years he was an outfitter, they'd got a big dump of snow in October, and all the deer tracks, instead of going down the creek like they were going to go to Jackson or go to the Red Desert to winter, all the deer tracks went up the mountain, went up the creek. And it took him a couple years to figure out what was going on, because every time, first snow, deer would leave the country. Then they couldn't find any deer, so he learned he had to hunt deer early and then elk later, because the elk do the opposite. The elk go to the elk refuge in Jackson. Well, then he moved to this side of the mountain range when I was in 8th grade, and come to find out, those deer, instead of going out to the Red Desert, they go back up over those big, huge mountains and then come down the North Fork of the Shoshone and the South Fork of the Shoshone, and they winter in Cody, and they winter in these big, huge windswept slopes that we have, which is also an astonishing thing. And the Game and Fish Department didn't know they did that. They didn't know that they were hunting, because we could hunt those deer from back then. You could hunt those deer through the month of November. They didn't realize they were killing high mountain deer on the winter, or on the rutting grounds in the winter range here in Cody.
And we've had
killing locals.
And that's not just hearsay. We've had Game and Fish guys in our area here that have told us that. They said, yeah, we remember when Ike Eastman was saying that's the same deer herd, and we thought he was crazy because we just didn't have the data to prove it. Now with GPS collar deer, they know 100% that's what's been happening this whole time. So these poor deer are hunted in the high country,
September, October, November.
They just never got a moment's rest. And so, locally here, we were thinking, or not we, but I mean the Game and Fish at the time was thinking, well, those are just, deer from up in the immediate mountains right there. They just came down. And no.
Yeah, it's the deer in Jackson that they were getting hunted with a rifle September 15th.
Yeah, it's crazy.
That's unbelievable. So, but with all this information, they're starting to do management plans and change season dates and change tag allocations that help them maintain those deer populations better, those carrying capacities better. And it's good to see all these winter ranges are in such good shape. What do you think, from your opinion, let's say we're at 11,000, carrying capacity is 40 in the Red Desert. How long do you think it's going to take? Is it going to take 10 years? Are we ever going to see it?
Well, obviously it's just highly weather dependent. There's a lot of other factors too, like highway crossings and other conservation projects. Like Game and Fish is doing, Muley Fanatics are doing, Mule Deer Foundation's doing, Wyoming Wildlife Federation is involved with and helping and doing and being an advocate for the deer. If it's like the perfect storm that eliminates a population, or what's facing mule deer is the perfect storm. There's like half a dozen factors. If we have some mitigation, for lack of better terms, in these factors, some stuff we can't control. We can't control the weather. Hopefully we have good weather patterns for the next few years. And then, you hear about the wildlife crossings, if there's more of those going across highways so deer aren't getting killed on the highway. If fencing projects are being done, which Scott Reekers just read us a whole list of projects that Muley Fanatics is involved with for wildlife friendly fence, which really isn't that monumental of a task to do, but it can be done so that they're not getting hung up in the barbed wire. If all of this stuff is happening at the same time, which it is, and the biggest thing for at least the Wyoming like the Region G, Region H herd, the Wyoming range herd, the sublet herd is what they call them. If we get the right weather for the next couple of years, I mean, look at how much is recovered just in 2 years or a year and a half, really.
Right.
If we get this for another 3 years, oh man, I mean, these deer are, reproducing exponentially and they're surviving to the next year, which is a good thing. And so if that happens, I mean, in short order, we could have the deer numbers back up to where they want to be, or where they need to be. But it's that darn Wyoming winter. You just never know.
So you were talking about Muley Fanatics and a bunch of their projects that they're working on. Let's talk about fencing, because a lot of their projects are fencing.
Yeah.
And this is another interesting, thing about you is not only do you have the mule deer bug, but you also have the biology side of it, and you worked in that agency. But then you left that and started a fencing company in North Dakota. And I'm sure it wasn't. You didn't set out to build wildlife friendly fence. That wasn't the reason. You were trying to feed little
family,
kids. And it was an opportunity that you saw. But let's talk about wildlife friendly fencing and how ranchers, if you're a rancher, wherever your fence is getting broke and it's happening year after year, that's a place that wildlife is using. That's a corridor. Mm-hmm. And some of these organizations are recognizing those corridors and doing it. What is a wildlife friendly fence?
Well, historically, if you're a rancher and say you were settling out here, and when you're getting past the open range days, which happened obviously when the range wars that we know about that happened across the West, and you're building a fence around your property to keep your animals in one spot and keep other people's animals out of your pasture. You want to build something pretty robust, right? This is your property, your livelihood, whatever. You don't want your cattle or sheep or whatever to be getting away. And so you're going to build a multi-strand barbed wire fence or sheep fence, which is definitely not a wildlife friendly fence, meaning you use a woven wire.
Yeah, that's the ones with the boxes in it.
Yep, the boxes, and it's like basically building a fence wall, for the bottom 3 feet or whatever of the fence. Well, obviously animals get caught in these fences, and then it also causes problems for a rancher who's trying to keep his fence up. And so over time, there has been kind of best practices for fencing, for wildlife-friendly fencing, that groups, not only the nonprofit groups like Muley Fanatics and Mule Deer Foundation and others, but state agencies are doing this, and then a private landowner can actually get cost sharing through agencies, federal agencies like the NRCS and Natural Resources Conservation Service and others, that you can apply for this cost sharing on the fencing to either develop your pasture system so that it's more productive for the livestock that's on the land.
Erosion, everything.
Everything, yeah. And actually, if it's managed right, if you're say a cattle rancher, your beef production goes up because you're managing them better, managing your land better. But even say right along the highway fences, things to keep wildlife from getting tangled up on those, or cross fences, is one of the ways. There's multiple ways to do it, but one of the ways that's the easiest is putting a smooth wire on the bottom. Not having woven wire, have a 3 or 4 strand barbed wire fence, but that bottom strand is not barbed wire, and maybe the top strand's not barbed wire. And, any rancher will tell you that once your cattle are trained that fence equals pain, and I don't want to go there, it's a non-factor. I still dabble a little bit for friends that want me, once people find out you know how to build fence, you get lots of friends, and they'll have me build fences, and I need a 5-strand barbed wire fence. I'm like, why?
Yeah, what are you trying to keep in there?
Even if you don't care about wildlife friendly, why would you want to have to repair all that fence over time? But some people are still stuck in that mindset. And for the most part, for cattle ranching, it's not necessary to have that robust of a fence. You can build it more wildlife friendly. You can get cost sharing on it, and then you kind of look like the hero. You're helping, your cattle, you're helping deer, and locals love you because you're being friendly to the wildlife and helping them survive. It's taking one more variable out of this equation that's leading to the decline of mule deer. You've got too many roads, too many fences that aren't wildlife friendly. You got at different times, oil and gas booms. You got,
Just
and again,
home developments.
Home developments, and that's actually our former governor Friedenthal years ago when I was with the Mule Deer Foundation. I was at an energy conference in near Jackson, and he came in and as governor at the time, and he said, it's fine to talk about oil and gas development and all this other stuff, but guess what? That's all reclaimed eventually. It's not reclaimed? Subdivision.
Yeah.
That's not going away, guys. That's here pretty much forever, or at least for many, many, many generations.
There's a place here in Wyoming by Cody that North Fork. North Fork is a huge winter range for elk and deer, and it is one of the most popular, most wanted places to build a home. And when I was a kid, this huge drainage, there was homes in the bottom, along the river, but nothing up the mountains. Now you can't go 10 acres and there's another home and another home.
Everywhere.
These poor deer and elk are their winter range is taken up with homes. Why? Because it's pretty.
Yep. And so it's just been the perfect storm. And so if we can do things, help with wildlife friendly fences, maybe choose a smarter place for a subdivision and how that development works. Oil and gas development. A lot of oil and gas companies are really proactive when it comes to wildlife friendly things that they're trying to do, especially over the last, I'd say 15 years. They're really conscious of that. Plus a lot of the guys who work in the oil patch, they're hunters, man. Yeah. They want to see the wildlife survive. So everybody, it just feels like everybody's finally coming to the table to talk together instead of, no, that industry's bad and that industry's bad and that industry's bad. They're all fighting and nobody's actually coming together. And then at the same time, we got people like Casey Stemler, who used to be with the Department of Interior, and he was instrumental in the funding behind the migration initiative. And so you have the perfect storm. You have the funding coming into play with people of all walks of life finally talking about landscape scale, multi-year projects, not just a project for 6 months because some, 23-year-old needs to finish their grad study. That's always been a pet peeve of mine with the wildlife management field. All these great things start, but then somebody gets their master's degree and that's all they needed from it anyway, so it goes away and there's no more funding for it.
Right.
And it's a waste of resources. Well, that's changing slowly because, again, there's money to apply to a lot of this stuff, or there has been. So, it's an interesting time. Definitely interesting.
This episode brought to you by Leupold Optics. The folks at Leupold have been manufacturing top-notch glass for over 100 years. They're a family-owned business just like mine, and that's why I'm so proud to partner with them to bring you these genuine conversations. If you're in the market for a rifle scope, look at the VX5 HD series. The VX5 HD line of scopes are the workhorse for the backcountry hunter. While you're at it, don't forget to check out the Leupold's full line of range-finding binos, regular binos, and their spotting scopes that are second to none and field-tested in some of the hardest conditions on Earth. The Leupold Gold Ring is the gold standard. Not to mention, in an extremely unlikely event that your Leupold glass has a hiccup, Leupold offers a lifetime guarantee that won't let you down. Leupold, be relentless. It is. And it's going to be, it's going to be interesting with the new administration to see what comes out of that. We know what the past administration and the previous before that was dumping money into wildlife conservation, maybe not in the right places, but they were doing it. It's going to be interesting to see once all the cards are dealt and they start playing this game, what's going to happen there. Because that's what you said, the money. That was a key thing, and that money came from the federal government, which comes from all of us. The other thing I want to touch on, you mentioned this, is other habitat or other species. We've been talking about mule deer because obviously you and I are both very active and love the mule deer, but there's other species that are benefiting from this, or the deer are benefiting from what the other species are being conserved. Sage grouse, we did a sage grouse film, and one of the reasons that we did that is because the sage grouse is kind of the canary of the western landscape, and what's good for sage grouse is good for deer, and what's good for sage grouse is good for elk, and what's good for sage grouse is good for everything. Make sure you guys go watch that. It's really interesting, all of the dynamics. You were talking about all the stakeholders coming to one place, and they have a sage grouse. I can't remember what the name of it is here.
It's a sage grouse implementation team. They call it SIGIN.
Yeah, SIGIN. And it has representatives from oil and gas. It has representatives from the sage grouse conservation. It has representatives from landowners. It has representatives from the federal government, from state government. And they all came together, and it was one of the first times that they all got in a room, and after the first uncomfortableness, they start talking and realize they're really after the same thing, doing it right.
Yep.
Making sure that they can still get that oil and gas, which if anybody's ever watched Landman, there's a couple really funny things in there that he talks about, that this whole world is built on petroleum, no matter what it is, if it's your lipstick all the way to the clothes you wear, your car you drive, the tires, all that. But also, so it's very important that we get to use the energy, but in a conscious way and doing it right. And it's very important that the ranchers get to use that grass, because it's good for the habitat as long as it's done right. Mm-hmm. It's very important for the sage grouse as long as it's done right. It's very important for the state agencies to manage that stuff as long as it's done right. The other one that I want to talk about is elk. One of the best conservation stories in North America is the Rocky Mountain elk. Mm-hmm. Back in the 80s, there was like 150,000 head of elk. Now there's over 4 million or some ridiculous thing. I mean, it is a huge success story. Mm-hmm. And how they did it, and the Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation obviously is very instrumental in that. They were very instrumental in land use and opening it up for the public. I think they're at 9 million acres they've opened up for public use now. Taking large ranches or large, woodland places that were closed to the public, now opening them up. Plus, they're very instrumental in getting elk all across North America. So there's a lot of really good, positive things happen in a nonprofit organization. I'm also going to talk a little bit about, because we're coming down to the Hunt Expo, and one of the big things of the Hunt Expo is the tags. How much is the Antelope Island tag going to go for? How much is the Arizona mule deer tag going to go for? One of the things that I just found out recently, tracked the money. I was talking, they just sold, if you guys weren't paying attention, I've been living under a rock the last couple of weeks. They just sold a sheep tag in New Mexico for $1.3 million. That's just the tag. That's not the hunt. Mm-hmm. That's not anything else related to it. That's just the tag. And for a long time, I was like, man, is this getting out of hand? I mean, $1.3 million for a tag? Number one, what kind of sheep did they find? And what is up with this? And where's the money going? Are the nonprofits getting this money? And are they using it in administration? You work for the Mule Deer Foundation, which, you worked for the Game and Fish, then you went fencing and found out that was not a lot of fun. And then you worked for the Mule Deer Foundation because you're still passionate in conservation. What do they do with the money?
Well, and that's, I think, our jaded side of hearing about shady money practices with things going to, whether it's our government or whatever, going into things that we don't want.
$5 million for condoms?
Yeah. Yeah. Some of that stuff that's come out recently is crazy. And so I think we're naturally jaded. You hear a $1.3 million sheep tag and you're like, that's sickening. That's disgusting. It's probably
a price on our wildlife. That's bullshit.
Yeah, it's commercializing it. All these things that we can be critical of. And one of the things by default, I think we're skeptical of where that money's going, right? I mean, the resource is bringing money in. That sheep tag brought a lot of money in. It better be going back to sheep management.
Into what is the question?
Yeah. And we have dug into that a little bit, actually. And thankfully, we know people in a lot of these organizations, so we can, and we've known them for a long time, so we can rip the Band-Aid off and ask, we're not too diplomatic with how we ask the questions usually. And I can't remember, but I know you probably remember it, the percentage of that tag that goes back in on the ground for sheep management.
Yeah. So talking to some of the guys at the Sheep Foundation, what they get. So say they take this tag and they auction it off at their annual banquet in Reno, which is a lot of fun. If you haven't gone to that, you may consider it. It's a lot of fun. Lots of young people, lots of older guys, really cool events where they have like a saddle pack competition, or they have a backpack race in a hotel lobby, and you're having to jump through the luggage carts and across, the furniture and stuff with a 50-pound pack or 100-pound pack. I can't remember, but it's a lot of fun. But I was asking him, I said, well, okay, 1.3 million. What are you guys going to do with all that money? And he gives this, whoa. We don't get all that money. We get a percentage of it, a small percentage. I think it was 10% of that money goes to the organization to help put on that banquet and to help
promote the tag.
Yeah, and their administration part to pay for the biologist and pay for the gal that's answering the phone and managing the memberships and all that stuff. And then they get another percentage of that, which I think is another 10% to market it. They got to get that guy that's got the 1.3 to be available when they have the auction. They got to pay the auctioneer. They got to pay, for the facility. They got to pay all that stuff. So they get another 10%. I believe it's 10%. Correct me. If you know exactly, correct me. Hit the comments, write what it really is. I got a guy here at Eastmans that's diving into this and is going to write an article about it in our sheep issue that's coming out in April. So if you want to know all the details on exactly how all this stuff works, make sure you subscribe to the magazine and get that copy, the sheep issue, which is May issue of the Eastmans Hunting Journal. But then all the rest of that, let's say it's $1 million. That $1 million goes directly back to New Mexico's Game and Fish, and it's earmarked for sheep, not for, we're going to go study the horny toad over here. It's for sheep, and it goes back to habitat and these projects like fencing projects and habitat, like whatever, forage that they're short, or water guzzlers, which is a big thing down there. It goes directly back into that. Now, some of the other species are going to benefit from it as well, because it's not just, I'm sorry, only the sheep can drink out of this guzzler. The deer, the elk, everything is going to get it as well. But that's a huge thing for me, because then at that point I went, wait, it's all going back to New Mexico, to the Game and Fish Department, and they're using it earmarked for sheep. I don't care. Sell it for $1 billion. I don't care. If the guy's going to pay it, dump $1 billion into the sheep habitat.
Yeah, the resource is then making money for the resource, which I like the idea of. When I was in my 20s, I introduced a bill, or with the help of a representative, introduced a bill in the North Dakota legislature to get a mule deer fundraising permit, because mule deer tags are hard to get up there. And we did it as a raffle, because the legislature wanted to say anybody can buy a raffle ticket. So it wasn't just if you were a wealthy person. It didn't, kick out the people that couldn't afford to bid on tags like that. They wanted kind of an equal opportunity. So I said, that's fine. And a lot of state laws are like this when it comes to these fundraising permits. In the North Dakota law for that particular permit, the only reason why, which I was happy that they dictated this, the only reason why they ended up allocating that one permit for fundraising purposes is because state law said 90% of the proceeds has to go back on the ground to help mule deer. So we could only use 10% of the projected ticket sales and everything, which after a couple of years you get pretty good at predicting what that's going to be, to advertise for it, to any administrative costs, which really aren't much. And so at the most, we could use 10%. So most of these tags that you see throughout the West, you're seeing 90% return on investment going back to the ground, on the ground, to help, whatever that resource is. And like you said, it's not just going to benefit, say if it's a mule deer fundraising permit, it's not just going to benefit the mule deer. Obviously, every other species that lives out there is on that particular landscape is going to benefit from it. And so as long as that the permits aren't coming out of the general pool and there's not thousands of them, to where the average Joe's hunting opportunities in the fall are being affected. Man, I like that the resource is making money for the resource.
Yeah, and I can't believe it's taken this long for me, to realize that that's how it all worked.
Yeah.
That's sad. And people need to know. People need to know that money, the majority, when I say the majority, 90% or 80% of that money is going right back to sheep.
Yep.
Right back to mule deer, right back to the habitat, right back to fencing, fenced crossings, to wildlife crossings. That's unbelievable. And I am all for that now. And, there's other things that they're doing at the Sheep Foundation. They do, one of the neat things that they do is the Less Than One Club, where they'll have, I don't know how many, it's significant, like 10 to 15 sheep hunts that are, you can put, your $10 or $35 in, and you can draw one of these sheep hunts. Mm-hmm. And it's gotten so cool that some of these older guys that do have the means, they'll buy additional ones and have them auction them off, that they're not, it's just kind of giving back to the resource, and it's, stemming another generation of sheep hunters. So this thing continue, because you never know, that 20-year-old kid could be the next guy that's bidding on that $1.3 million tag in 20 years. He may have learned how to use AI right. I don't know. Something. Yeah. But this is a really interesting, very dynamic conversation. I know we kind of got off the here. We were talking about the winter range and how it looks this year, and hopefully we can get a couple more years, and went into, all these other things that are conservation and deer habitat. But I think it's really important. And I think, as a consumer, one of the questions I always ask myself, okay, what can I do? What can I do to help? The number one thing you can do is get involved with an organization. Go to a Muley Fanatics banquet. Go to a Mule Deer Foundation banquet, a Sheep Foundation, Elk Foundation. Go to those banquets. Get a membership. Sit down. Talk to some of the board members. Maybe get on the board members. If nothing else, if you don't have money to donate, put your time in.
Yep.
Go to one of those fencing projects. Everybody can pound a nail in and put a rail on the top. That's the thing you didn't really talk about. One of the easy ways is smooth wire. But if you know a corridor, putting a rail, putting a pole on the very top is actually the best way, because they don't get their feet tangled up in the wire and then they die. Because that rail, they can bounce off of it and not get tangled up.
Yep. Another thing I was going to mention too, you mentioned some of those wildlife groups or sportsman's groups that really put their money where their mouth is. Another couple groups that we generally don't think of as being North America wildlife focused groups that help on these same type of projects are Dallas Safari Club and Safari Club. And I don't know much about Houston Safari Club, but I would assume same would go for them. You hear Safari Club and you just think Africa.
Right.
And man, do they do a bunch in North America. Not only money on the ground, but they are a very, very strong lobby in D.C., and they make a lot of really good wildlife policies happen at the federal level. And so don't overlook those groups either. In fact, TRCP, the
Sportsman Alliance.
Yep, Theodore Roosevelt Conservation Partnership. They're big on sportsmen's fighting for sportsmen and sportsmen's access, sportsmen's rights. Sportsman's Alliance is one that I just recently became more aware of the last couple of years, and hanging out with some of their guys that work there and talk about guys that are in the fight in the legal systems and with ballot box biology wars that are going on. They really fight the fight for sportsmen's rights when it's coming to when they're fighting against the outlawing of predator hunting. They're trying, fighting hard to get things like grizzly bears delisted. I mean, there's just a ton of things that they're in the fight on across the country. And so that's another one to get involved with, or at least check out. Yeah, Howl, that's another one. There's so many good ones. And now more than ever, like we talked about here just a few minutes ago, that a lot of them are starting to work together and play nice in the sandbox. So over the years, it's kind of been like, this is my baby and this is what I'm going to do, and you just leave me alone and go do your thing. Well, now everybody's realizing, man, if we can combine our resources, now we can build another overpass over the highway that costs millions of dollars. And the auction tags that go for a lot of money, even within individual states like commissioners tags, that money can be used for some of these projects that a normal game and fish department budget or fish wildlife parks budget can't pay for that stuff.
Yeah.
And so that's where, sometimes you wonder, you go to these wildlife banquets or the big conventions and you wonder, is this money really, where's this money going? A lot of times it's not and sometimes the individual groups actually go out and do the work, but some of the power is that they can actually make a contribution to a state access program or, donate to something that the game and fish departments are doing or land management agencies are doing so that they finally have the budgets then to go forward and do some of the things they want to do. But they're hamstrung by budgets and by money. So
and the other part of that is the history of so one of the other organizations I want to talk about is Boone and Crockett, because I've had a tendency as older I get, this happened less and less, but when I was younger I just looked at these organizations, there's a bunch of old gray-haired rich guys, and I don't want to do it with that. That's not who I am. Let them buy the $1.3 million sheep tag or whatever. But now, the older I get, I understand how these organizations work, and every one of them has something unique. Mule Deer Foundation, they tote themselves on habitat. Elk Foundation totes themselves on putting elk on the landscape to hunt. That's their deal. Mm-hmm. One of the other organizations that has been around for a really long time, arguably one of the first, probably the first, is the Boone and Crockett. And there's a lot of people, even in the hunting community, that looks at Boone and Crockett like, well, yeah, that's just a record book. Records. It's a giant measuring stick. Guys pounding their chest that they got the 192. They got a deer in the book, or they got an elk in the book, or whatever. But really, it's more than that. Their organization is a lot. It's not just the record book. And what the record book really was started, and I'll have you talk to this because you did a huge, I don't want to say thesis, but you wrote into this and what it's really about. Why are they important, and what are they doing different?
So the Boone and Crockett Club, kind of what I alluded to with SCI and DSC, is one of the things that they're very active in is lobbying at the DC level, fighting for sportsmen's rights. But to your point that they are more than just a records keeping book, Theodore Roosevelt and a bunch of other his cohorts, I can't remember all of them, that they all had the similar mindset. They all came together. Back in the late 1800s, they were seeing the detriment that market hunting was causing our wildlife populations. Because you think about when people were coming over here for the previous couple hundred years up to that, it just seemed like America's wildlife resources were so sustainable that there's no amount of hunting that could even put a dent in the populations. There's so much on the landscape. Well, obviously that wasn't true.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that. You say market hunting. What is market hunting?
Well, once Europe discovered all of the wildlife resources that were over here, there was a huge market for furs and for meat and for antlers, for horns, and some of the other byproducts that those things can produce, to where guys were hired to go kill as much as they could and send it over to Europe, or sometimes just kill as much as you could and feed the railroad guys that were building the railroad across this country. A lot of different reasons, but the badge of honor at that time, before Theodore Roosevelt and Boone and Crockett Club, was how many animals can you kill? It's whack them and stack them. If it's brown, it's down, right? That, like all those old sayings.
There was a Scottish guy that came over, and he had his own train, and he was a Scottish royalty. I cannot remember his name, but he came over here and claimed to fame, and it was and there were some Americans that were with him that backed it up. He killed 30,000 buffalo in the amount of a couple years. 30,000.
It's dumbfounding.
He'd go into a buffalo group of buffalo and shoot every single one of them.
Yep. And so when it was getting pretty well known that we got a problem here, this is not sustainable at this level, Theodore Roosevelt and the others also knew that competition is a good thing, and they did a remarkable job at conveying the message and this is really dumbing down the conversation, but conveying the message that you're more of a man if you actually exercise restraint and you go after only the biggest and best. And they came up with a scoring system that, like, sometimes nowadays we go, that's so dumb that they score it that way. Like, why am I getting a deduction for that? Because they were intentionally trying to promote the most perfect representation of each species. And you're more of a man if you can hold out for that giant mule deer or that big elk or whatever the
perfect species, aka
perfect.
Showing restraint, selective harvesting, and keeping maybe that non-perfect species on the landscape to breed again.
And that's where the term trophy hunting became a thing, was because, nowadays people look at trophy hunting, that terminology is negative. Actually, if you're a true conservationist, trophy hunting, by its original definition, was meant to bolster populations, get animals to maturity, have healthy wildlife populations so that they would be sustainable for the future through selective harvesting.
Right.
And we're trying to do our part here at Eastmans at retelling those stories. I mean, we're doing it right now, but we do it in print format, we do it in video format, and everything, because it is such a key linchpin in North American model of wildlife conservation, which it wasn't even called that at the time. You got Valerius Geist and Shane Mahoney basically coined that term and looked at the history and what got us to this point. And the North American model, how we manage wildlife now, based on selective harvesting, and we talk about preference points and draw odds. That's all part of that selective harvesting, because if there wasn't those systems set up, there wouldn't be an animal living on the landscapes. It'd be a free-for-all, just like it used to be. And so it's important to remember where we came from. And the Boone and Crockett Club was one of the first conservation organizations in this country, period. And they did a phenomenal job at telling that story back in those days when it started, all the way up to where we are now. And now, unfortunately, they're largely looked at as somebody who just scores antlers and all they care about is a score of antlers as an ego thing. No, that's not what it's about. That's not at all what it's about. But it's about exercising restraint, honoring those mature animals that happen to be taken by a hunter, and also all the behind-the-scenes political stuff and conservation projects that the Boone and Crockett Club does. You have to go to their website. They are an amazing group that they will tell you they've done a poor job at telling their story.
Yep.
As far the history's there, a lot of people know the history, but currently what they do right now, it's pretty amazing, the stuff they get done behind the scenes.
You said something interesting. What do you mean by honoring that trophy?
Honoring that trophy. Well, I am not somebody who worships an animal. I worship Jesus Christ, period. But honoring that animal helped to feed my family. It is very special when you see an animal hit maturity, because, like we talked about earlier in the podcast, if a buck mule deer doesn't hit its true antler potential until 7.5, most of them don't live past 4.5. That's pretty cool when you see one that actually hits that stage. That's a whole nother category. Case in point, when I first got married, my wife is not a hunter. She has taken hunter safety. She has hunted, but she doesn't live to go hunting like I do. But she comes out hunting once in a while with me. And when we were first married, didn't have kids yet or anything, we were hunting mule deer, and we stumbled upon a mature buck. He was beautiful. She had never seen a deer that close. Even though it was during the rifle season, we were about 35, 40 yards from this thing. And he saw us, and he was hoping, you can tell by the look on his face, hoping that we didn't see him.
Yeah.
And he was right there. And he ended up bounding off, takes off running, and before he crests a hill, does the Achilles heel of a mule deer and stops and turns around and look back. And my uncle had a permit, and he actually harvested him. So she got to see up close, and then the shot, and then the harvest, and of course field dressing and all that. You cannot believe how excited she was. She didn't grow up doing that. She had no context. She had no point of reference. And the look of sheer excitement on her face at seeing a mature representation of the species was that was honoring that animal, because she knew she was seeing something special, because in her entire life she had never seen anything like that before. Mm-hmm. And so honoring that animal, being respectful to it, and also being a part of like I tell my kids, I've got 4 kids, and my son, who's the oldest, he lives to hunt like I do. Then I've got 3 girls, and they hunt largely because I make them. And part of the reason why I make them hunt is I tell them I want them to understand what it means to be an active participant in wildlife conservation. Because number one, when they get out on their own, even if they never hunt again after they leave home, they understand it. If this ballot box biology thing keeps coming up, which it will, depending on the state, depending on the issue, they can be informed of what the issue actually is and vote accordingly. Maybe they'll be supportive of their husband someday if he's into the outdoors, get their kids into hunter safety. They will understand the purpose of it and that they've been raised in that culture. I said on one of our elk episodes a few years ago that it really annoys me when people call hunting a hobby.
Yeah.
Because it's not a hobby, it's a way of life, especially for us. And it's not a sport. It is a way of life. We're active participants in wildlife conservation. And that's the message that we need to be better as sportsmen to get out to the non-hunting public, because statistics have shown that when hunting is exhibited to the non-hunting public in a tasteful way, most people are cool with it. They may never hunt, but they're cool with it. They're not anti-hunters. Most people are not anti-hunters. Yeah. Most people are non-hunters that are fine with it as long as it's presented in a constructive way.
Well, what happened in Colorado with the trophy hunting of lions and how they voted to continue doing that is that's a very liberal state, a very anti-hunting state, if you could call it that, and they still voted to maintain it.
Yep. Because without hunters, and if some hunters may not know this, or if there's any non-hunters listening to this podcast, without hunters, and this isn't Brandon Mason's opinion, there's statistical facts on this, both from a funding standpoint, logistics standpoint, etc. Without hunters, we would not have the same land management and wildlife management in this country that we have today, and it wouldn't be as sustainable as it is today.
Yeah, because the money that the anti-hunting organizations raise, if it's for the organizations in Colorado that were trying to get rid of mountain lion hunting, the money that they were raising to do that goes to marketing, it goes to attorneys, and it goes to administration. None of that.
Yep.
0.00% of that money goes back to the conservation, to the management of the actual resource they're fighting for. None of it goes back to habitat for the mountain lions, or none of it goes back to management of the wildlife. None of it. No. All of the money that we spend on tags, and then the Pittman-Robertson, which is weapons, ammo, guns, bows, all that stuff, all of that money goes back to the management. So if you take the sportsmen and the shooters out of this equation by making it illegal, where's the money come from to manage the wildlife?
Yeah. Well, and think of it this way.
It comes from the government, and they're really good at it because, my mail is spot on.
Well, and we all complain about the percentage of taxes we have to pay, right? We don't like taxes. Why do I bring taxes up? Sportsmen are one of the only groups of people in this country's history that have voluntarily taxed themselves to help the thing that they love. Yep. If you come to me and go, hey, I want to tack a little bit more taxes on, take more out of your paycheck or a higher percentage out of what you're buying at the store, and you're going to feel good about it. I'll be like, I don't think so.
Yeah.
But when it comes to this, we are okay with it. Yep. This is a part of the whole picture that's funding like a huge percentage
Billions.
Of what even the people that don't hunt. If you get to go out and enjoy photographing wildlife and hiking in the national forest, thank a hunter, because without hunters, this country's wildlife management would be unrecognizable.
Yep. Yeah, I was asked one time. You and I went to it was a backpacking show here in Salt Lake. They call it the Outdoor Retailer Show. And one of the guys came up to me, recognized me, and asked if I thought that backpacks and everything that was in that building, which is sleeping bags and tents and backpacks and boots and trekking poles and whatever else is in there, if they should pay a Pittman Robertson and that money should go to trails. I said, hell yes. Why not? You guys are buying all this stuff and you're recreating in the Forest Service, except the stay-at-home mom in downtown Denver that is never going to do that is paying with her income tax. She's paying to maintain that. Mm-hmm. She's never going to use it. Why not? Why don't you guys pick up a little bit of the bill, half, a chunk of that bill, since you're using it? And you go, well, I pay a use fee. Let's not go down that road, because the use fees aren't big enough. They're not enough money that it costs to manage them.
Yeah, not even close.
We have a park, a federal park here, just outside of Wyoming, or outside of our town, that they were charging a use fee to use the park. Yep. And it's a lake, and people swim there and boat there and all that stuff. And the new gal come in that's running that park service, and she did the math, or somebody did the math and found out that it was costing them money to collect the money for the use fee.
Yeah, the system to collect the use fees was more expensive than the use fees.
Yeah.
So that doesn't hold water. It doesn't cover it.
So it needs to be a bigger chunk, and using the easiest way is using the retailers or the manufacturers. Just like your income tax, you're not paying your income tax. The employers are, because it's narrowing down the number of people that have to send checks in. Well, it's been a really interesting conversation, Brandon. We've touched a lot of nonprofits. I just wanted to sit down and talk about what you saw in the Winter Range versus what I saw, and we went into the political side of
wildlife
management. Yeah. And so it's awesome. I hope you guys enjoyed it. If there's a couple organizations that we talked about, check them out, get involved. If you're sitting on the sidelines and are not involved in this stuff, you don't have a say. These organizations are the ones that are changing the landscape, doing great things. Also, make sure you check out the rest of our stuff. We have some podcasts. Brian Barney does a really good job at Eastmans Elevated, and he talks about hunting strategies, talks with some great hunters and what they've been doing, what they've learned this fall. If you're a bow hunter, we have Life of the Bow Hunter, which is really in-depth. Brian and Dan Picard do a really good job in talking about really, really narrowing it down to gear, to broadheads, to everything you need to know about bow hunting and life of a bow hunter. What they're doing in the off season, where they're going hunting in the off season. Check out our YouTube channel. We have a really cool film that just came out. It was New Zealand. Dan went over there and found out that you can hunt elk in the spring, basically New Zealand, the roar. And you can do it pretty economically, so check that out. And then I hope to see you at the Hunt Expo this week in Salt Lake. It's a lot of fun down there. If you do stop by our booth, it's in the back corner. We're doing podcasts. There's a ton of different people, not just our podcast hosts, but Boone and Crockett and Mule Deer Foundation and a bunch of other podcasts will be in there. So stop by, check them out. Until next time, I appreciate it, and thanks for listening to this chapter in our journal.